Hi guys, my name is Shane Cuthbert and I would like to welcome you back to yet another video in the Change Your Life series, okay? That's exactly what we're doing. We're trying to change your life. We're trying to overcome those hurdles, those obstacles and those problems that you have. In this episode specifically, we're going to talk about the psychology of motivation and what that means. So in this lesson, you'll be able to sort of, work out what is motivating us and driving us consciously and unconsciously, and what we need to do specifically to become motivated. So this is something that's probably really important for people that are struggling in particular with motivation. So yeah, let's jump into the lesson and find out what it's all about. See you on the other side. In the last lesson, we talked about, a lot about what's going on inside of us, unconsciously when we make decisions, we make choices. And we discovered that obviously there's a conversation constantly going on between the inner child and the inner parent. Now, to get those things on your list of cans, we discussed how to do that. And the reason, the way to do that was that we had to not only obviously have permission to do that from our inner parent, but our inner child, needed to be confident in that thing. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about how do we build that confidence so that you can become the person that you want to become. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to build confidence in anything that you want to achieve, because there is a massive hurdle that a lot of people that are trying to build confidence run into, and that's that their understanding of what it takes to build that confidence is completely wrong. So we're going to get to the bottom of that, and we're going to change that today. To make this as easy for you to understand as possible, I want to talk about an example. You may have heard of it before. It's quite a famous example. It's a group of studies known as the candle problem, or the candlestick studies. So we're going to talk about that. If you were a volunteer in one of these candlestick studies, what you would do is you would enter a room, okay, and what you would see is a few items laid out on a table, okay? You would see a candle, you would see a box of tacks or pins, and I think there was a match and a lighter. Now, the researchers would tell you that you have to figure out a way, using those items, to light the candle without having any of the candle wax dripping back onto the table. Okay, so you had to attach the candle to the wall, light the candle, and make sure no wax touches the table. So people sort of went into this room, okay, and they got really, really creative. Some people were, trying to melt the wax just a little bit to the wall so that they could get, the candle to stick, but that didn't really work either. It would stop, for a couple of minutes, but then eventually, the wax would start running down the wall. So that didn't really work. Other people were trying to use the tacks to try and, smudge or press the candle wax onto the wall to try and get that to stick to the wall. But as the candle burnt, obviously that didn't work either. So really, there was a lot of different things that people were trying that didn't really work. But after about 15 minutes or so, people started to figure out that all you actually had to do was tip the box of tacks over, okay, and then tack the box to the wall, put the candle in the box and light the candle, and the box would catch all of the wax and none of the wax would end up on the table. So the original aim of this experiment, or this test, was to basically demonstrate something called functional fixedness. Now, functional fixedness is basically, how to explain when somebody looks at that box of tacks, they see it as a box of tacks. Okay, so their mind was then unable to think outside the box, so to speak, and see that, if you just tip those tacks out, you would also have a box. So instead of seeing tacks, a candle, and a box, these people are looking at the box of tacks and just seeing a box of tacks, okay? They weren't taking into consideration the fact that that box was actually a separate thing. It's only when we start, our creativity starts working, that's really when we start to, kick into gear. We really start problem solving, and we're really able to start thinking outside of the box. So again, people were looking at this box of tacks and seeing it as a single use, so that box was, for holding the tacks. So the tacks didn't go everywhere, which makes sense. The tacks were purchased in a box. The thing is, though, once you start getting creative and you start problem solving, you start to see that box does actually have a dual use, okay? It can be purposed in a bunch of different ways, and that's basically how you arrive at the solution to the candlestick problem. Okay, now here's something that's really interesting when we look at the history of the candlestick problem. So a few years later, the candlestick problem was done again, only there was a few changes, and the biggest change really was the addition of incentives. If you were a participant in Group 1, you would have been shown into the room, you would have basically seen the candle, the tack box, the matchbox sitting on the table, you would have been shown the problem, you would have been explained basically what they wanted you to do, okay? So again, it was the exact same setup as, the original candlestick problem. Someone would have explained to them that the aim was to get the candle attached to the wall without, dripping on the table. But you would also be told that you were being timed. You would have been told, if you were in Group 1, that you're only being timed because we want to know the average time it takes people to work out this particular problem. However, if you were a participant in Group 2, you would be told something slightly different. Now, you would have been told that as you're being timed, we're going to compare your particular results with all of the other groups. And if your score, if your score ends up in the top 20% of participants, we are going to give you a big, fat, juicy financial reward. The researchers went on to say, in fact, if you actually do better than that, if you actually come first, if you actually become the top achiever, you're going to get an even larger reward, for achieving that. So basically now, if you're in Group 2, you are now incentivized, to solve the problem. You've got a motive to try harder, to work faster, because you now want to achieve a better outcome than Group 1, because obviously you want to get the money, You want to win the money, you want to win the prize. Group 1 isn't incentivized like you are, And that's the basis for this study. Now, one would think that you were in Group 2, you would be able to achieve a better outcome because of the incentive. However, you would be surprised to know that Group 2, the incentivized group, the group that were motivated and driven by, money and to win and be number one, actually did poorly, They actually didn't perform as well as Group 1. On average, they were more than 20% slower than Group 1. On average, Group 1 achieved better outcomes. Now, just take a moment to think about that. It's almost the exact opposite of what we, traditionally think about motivating people, right? We traditionally think that you can motivate people, with rewards, That's why people go to work, to make money, to make income. This however, shows that that's not entirely the case. Now, usually when parents want to motivate their children, and teachers want to motivate students, employers want to motivate their employees, the usual approach is to offer them some kind of reward, That might be an award in school, it might be some praise from your parents, or it's going to be a financial reward from your employer. And yet, these, group of studies actually found that this is not the case. That's not it at all. Now, here's the really fascinating bit. This is where it gets even more interesting, This is another study This is another same study, same situation again, still the candle problem, but it's a little bit different. Now what they did this time is they repeated the same study, but what they did differently is, when these people walked into the room, the box of tacks was already spilled out onto the table for them. So when they went into the room, they were able to see straight away that that box was a separate thing to the tacks, and then they could therefore use that box as part of the solution. Now, in this case, that barrier of functional fixedness was no longer an issue, okay? It was no longer a part of the study because they had chosen to empty that box. Now, what's interesting in this study is that in this time, group 2, the incentivized group, okay, they were still given the same reward as the first study, but they actually did better this time than group 1 that wasn't incentivized. On average, the group that was incentivized and given more money actually did perform faster and better than the non-incentivized group. So this is the complete opposite to basically what the results we saw in the first study. So what was the difference? To explain this further, I want to just rewind a little bit and just backtrack a little bit, okay? And I want to talk about what is going on in our mind when someone says to you that you have the potential to succeed at this thing. The exact moment when one of the researchers says to the people in group 2 that I'm going to give you an incentive if you perform better, if you perform quicker, it now becomes a competitive environment, okay? It now creates competition among those people in the study. So when you are involved in a competition, you have the potential to win, okay? You have the potential to win that race, you win the trophy, get the reward, you can come first. But by definition, when there is competition, you also have the ability to lose. Okay, so you may come last. Okay, you might miss out on rewards. You might miss out on the trophies or the certificates. If you are in a situation where you have the ability to succeed, you also have the potential for failure. So there's two incentives going on when you make something a competition. Not only are you incentivized to win the reward, okay, you want the recognition, you want the fanfare of being the best at that thing, at winning that thing, getting that result, but you're also motivated and incentivized by the fact that you don't want to be the loser, okay? Naturally, we as humans don't want to be the loser. We're naturally competitive. So you're incentivized on two different levels there, okay? You want to be the best and you don't want to be the worst. Whenever you have the potential to succeed, it becomes a competitive environment, which also gives us the potential to fail. This increases the parental voice of must, which in turn creates that pressure. Pressure will improve our performance and progress if we already feel confident. But if we don't, it slows us down, wears us out, and eventually we end up giving up. So whilst the goal is to create confidence, when it comes to tackling our weaknesses, we first need to take the pressure off.